It was a city of machinery and tall chimneys from which endless snakes of smoke emerged, never unrolled. It had a black canal and a river that ran purple with smelly dyes. Enormous piles of buildings full of windows in which a clatter and tremor were heard throughout the day, where the machinery pistons worked monotonously. It contained several large streets, although I like some more than others, and many small streets even more similar to each other, inhabited by people equally similar to each other, who entered and left at the same hours with the same noise to do the same work, and for whom each day was the same as the previous and the next, and each year was the replica of the previous and the next. Charles Dickens, Hard Times, 1854. It seemed necessary to me to include this small initial quote, written in the antiquity of humanity compared with the empire, to better illustrate one thing: that despite all the vast and glorious achievements of humanity throughout its golden age and its subsequent descent into the age of the empire, the average citizen is still barely better off than in the 19th century. They lived condemned to a life of exhausting physical work, to the daily threat of indefinite dangers, whether their own or others, to generally precarious health, and to widespread crime that permeated everything. Bearing all this in mind, today we will talk about the vast, vaguely monolithic structures known as Hive Cities. I will also point out that this will be the first video in which Hive Cities and their inhabitants are discussed, but since there is so much to say about these places, everything cannot be covered in a single video. Well, it could be, but it would probably last 6 hours, so I'm not going to go into the details of the gangs and so on for now. Today we will talk more about Hive Cities as structures, how their economies work, and give an overview of citizenship and the speculative origins of these vast megastructures that, believe it or not, are said to exist in 85% of the worlds that make up the Imperium. Now, I should point out that it would be unfair to allow such a broad characterization as the one I just made to stand regarding all Hive Cities as unique places of condensed human suffering. This is simply the evocative generalization of what Hive Cities look like, and that is because, in general, it is going to be quite accurate. However, of course, in a galaxy in which it is estimated that there are 1 million human worlds, there cannot be a definitive state that is universally true. It is almost always going to be a moving scale in which some worlds could even be what we would consider relatively comfortable, while others would be better described as a literal hell on Earth. It is also worth mentioning that there are planets in the galaxy that have not yet been discovered by the Empire and may completely ignore everything that has happened during the last 15 millennia. There are also others that, due to some administrative error, have been lost and may have already completely forgotten that they were once part of the Empire or an empire, though they may still be dotted with relics and symbols of their order. In short, there is room for almost any description, always within a reasonable framework of rationalization. However, to our misfortune as seekers of narratives and information, the sketches of worlds within the Imperium that seem more pleasant or more like a post-industrial society are extremely scarce, so we do not know how they work or how they fit into the structure and bureaucracy of the Imperium. Not to mention the obvious burning questions about how we might consider that the Imperium can or would want to allow something like an educated population that then has to balance various ideological considerations that are theoretically imposed on the citizens who live there, but who also have to deal with their opinions of the Imperium. This is also not clear, since although in theory those worlds can and do exist, the details are difficult to pinpoint for probably obvious reasons, since, from the perspective of how those places would fit within the general structure of the Imperium, it is really a bit complicated. The Imperium extends throughout the galaxy, with worlds that are home to billions of people under the glorious psychic power of the God Emperor of humanity. As we have already explored in depth, these worlds are very diverse in both population, purpose, and technological capacity, and this only becomes more difficult to quantify given the distances involved, as well as the danger of warp travel and the strange distortions of time that these can create, not to mention, of course, the standard threats within the Materium itself. Xenos invasions, civil unrest, power struggles by traitors in the government, and the corruption of the darkness of chaos. Something that is less frequently noticed is that the Imperium continues to expand into new worlds, many of which have been marked by the exploring forces as suitable for habitability, if not purely for the acquisition of natural resources. Thus, while some worlds will have small active populations that perform a care function, others are home to cities saturated with human population, known in general terms as hive planets or hive worlds. Many millennia ago, these planets were some of the first to be colonized by humanity when it ventured into the galaxy to begin the colonization process, and this was the period now known as the Dark Age of technology. These settlers, isolated and without any kind of support network, some of these colonies perished or were simply lost, but most found worlds to begin new human societies. They often cannibalized their vast ships that had taken generations to reach these new virgin worlds, so it is likely that few or no ships from this era have survived. In some cases, the recovered materials were used to create new settlements that, over time, have grown into the enormous megastructures known as Hive Cities. It is possible that, in some cases, the energy sources that power some of the oldest hive cities that have survived are, in fact, archaeological technology recovered from these ships. But since this happened so long ago, and the nature of hive cities implies that, although fragments of Dark Age technology can be sought, they are very likely to be hidden and lost in their seemingly infinite depths. Hive worlds, while supporting a huge population, may also be focused on military industry or a combination of needs. Most hive cities, at a minimum, will maintain a basic level of industry and manufacturing, but others focus exclusively on production. For example, those found on a forge world will most likely have a high percentage of the population working as labor for the mechanicus. Most industrial or infrastructure-related activities will also be controlled by what are known as guilds. Guilds are an ancient concept and basically consist of a clan or group that comes together to represent a certain product that is manufactured or a resource that they want to control, and this could be through respect, experience, or, let's say, others, as we have learned previously. However, while a hive city can produce machines, ammunition, and other valuable products, its most important product for the Imperium is people, and this is where it is worth remembering that hive cities are said to contain between 5,000 and 100,000 million people, so their birth rate and the general availability of labor is extremely significant. Not to mention the fact that on planets designated exclusively as hive worlds, they can contain between 5 to 20 hive cities throughout the planet. And if it is said that there are multiple groups of hives spread across the surface of the planet, you can begin to understand that a hive world of the Imperium could contain anything within the scope of, let's say, even being conservative, 50,000 million humans, up to a maximum estimate of something like 2 trillion. That is, 2 with 12 zeros after it. To put these figures into perspective on Earth, the total human population in March 2020 was estimated to be 7,800 million people. So, taking this scale into account, you can begin to realize why the empire of humanity tends to see humans as a resource that can be thrown with weight against a problem, unless they are valuable individuals, and we have already talked about this before, as well as the difficulty humans have in measuring empathy outside their personal sphere of experience, and I am not going to ramble with another analogy today, as I did in the video in which I talked about the resource worlds and the pandemic apocalypse. But the question remains, and I think it is too obvious that, from a certain point, the number of people begins to lose meaning for the average citizen, because it is beyond the reach of human understanding. And that is how the empire works when you exist as an individual in a hive city with tens of billions of citizens who, in all likelihood, have never seen anything outside the walls of their vast structure, perhaps not even the sky, and who often live a life without education, performing very humble jobs. You have to be very insightful to understand that they have no idea of the losses occurring out there in the darkness of space in some distant world. Imperial soldiers who are transported out of the world rarely return. Even if they survive multiple engagements, their absence in the hive is nothing worthy of mention. At the other end of the scale, Imperial troops appear in the upper command system as simple numbers on a board that move almost as in a horrible numbers game. Meanwhile, Other xenospecies, such as the Tau or the Eldar, will act with true caution in battles, often willingly demonstrating that discretion is the better part of valor. The Xenos, such as the Orcs or Tyranids, at the opposite end of the scale, will launch relentless waves of horror on their enemies, simply seeking to drown their target in a literal tsunami of blood and attrition. Thus, while humanity wields its elite and its less numerous forces, such as the Astartes, it will also use its own wave of bodies to crush its enemies in the form of the Imperial Guard. Strange as it may seem, it is now clear that, in many respects, the Imperium seems to behave more like the Xenos, whom we consider abominable monsters who cruelly drown their enemies in a sea of corpses. The tactics of Imperial commanders, in general, seem to be very similar: to crush the enemy by saturation, sending successive waves of their own men against them. The Imperial Guard do not earn the title Mace of the Imperium for nothing. They are the embodiment of brute force, a blunt instrument to crush their enemies. No careful thought is required, just a vast mass of human flesh, bones, tendons, and soul. For many Hive cities, this is, in fact, their true purpose. Manufacturing and so on have their value. But their most important task is simply to produce a continuous supply of raw manpower, the vast majority of whom will be indoctrinated into the belief system of the Holy Emperor, trained in and around their hives, and eventually called upon to leave their world, never to be seen again. Now, before going into more detail about the anatomy of a hive city, I would like to clarify one specific thing, and that is to address the issue of the economy, because people always want to know how this works, how trade works in 40k, whether average citizens earn money, whether they can buy their way out of horror. Surprisingly, the answer is no, but the first thing to keep in mind is that we are in the 41st millennium. It is not our world. I know it seems absurdly obvious, but I want to emphasize it because our way of conceiving wealth is not the same as that of the Hive Cities or the Imperium. There are many forms of what we might consider currency in the Imperium: credits, crowns, eagles, thrones. Basically, whatever you can think of. Some of them are accepted on a galactic scale, but most only within a sector, a system, a planet, a hive, and even at a level as low as the territory of a singular guild. Now, the only true currency that exists in the Imperium is what is known as thrones or throne geld, which basically means the Emperor's currency. Now, many people will say that the Imperium does not have a real monetary system, and that is true in a sense because it does not operate any type of centralized economic system, and certainly nothing like stock market. However, at the same time, there are individuals such as the rogue traders and the Imperial merchant fleet, and even ordinary Imperial citizens, whether guards, acolytes, or others, who seem to be able to accumulate throne geld, or at least some localized form of currency. So it can be somewhat confusing, and it has never been explained with particular clarity how it works exactly. Like many details of 40k, it's all winks and hints, and you can fill in the gaps. However, now I'm going to try to do it, and maybe later I will cut this part to make a separate video. The important thing to keep in mind is that the Imperium works with something between a barter system and a proper economy. And if that sounds vague, it is because it has to be that way. I think the most likely comparison is the Middle Ages, and I want to point out again that is very vague because things related to trade and the minting of coins developed at different times around the world. In the 20th and 21st centuries, even the average person has to have a fairly basic knowledge of long-distance trade because we see it and use it. People have been doing international trade, even at an individual level, more than ever because we have means of communication, economy, currency, etc., much more reliable than in the past. In addition, we can easily record the large amount of information to keep track of everything in real time. But what did people do before this? Well, before everything was digital, people used to keep very detailed records of the goods that were traded. The ports of entry had to record the manifests of the ships, etc. And during and before those times, there were groups like the merchant guilds, which basically facilitated the trade of goods and ensured that prices remained relatively stable. And this is, of course, my very simplified version of how all this works. So trade at the local level with simple goods was never going to be especially complicated, but merchant guild that basically facilitated the trade of goods and ensured that prices remained relatively stable. Of course, this is a very simplified version of how it all worked, but trade at the local level with basic products was never especially complicated, since people did not travel much in ancient times. You lived in an area and visited the nearby towns, so you were likely to know what you could exchange your sheepskins or your grain for. If these prices changed one day, you would probably want to know why, and maybe there would be some official in the town who could mediate if there was a dispute. Later on, that is why you would have figures like a customs official to ensure that goods were sold at the correct prices and also that people did not, for example, dilute the wine or sell you poor quality products. But in general, local trade is relatively stable because you know the people you buy and sell to, and you know what is happening in your area. So you can calculate the price and value of the products and things that are exchanged quite well. Also, just like in the Empire, the nobility of this era did not care too much who sold what or who went bankrupt at the local level, since as long as they got what they wanted, the rest was quite irrelevant. It is a bit simplistic, but that is basically how the Imperium works. They do not care too much about things at the local level. They only care about the high end and making sure that their demands are met. But what would happen if you wanted to travel a great distance, for example, between two countries or continents, or in the case of 40,000, between planets and even star systems? Well, just like in ancient times in the Imperium, as an individual or leader of a guild, you cannot call in advance and say, "Hello, I have a huge shipment to sell. Do you guarantee me a price?" For that, you would need a very powerful astropath. So in the Imperium, it is very similar to how it was in the Middle Ages. As an individual, you may have a valuable cargo to transport, but who is to say that, after chartering an expensive ship and traveling for months, when you arrive at the planet that you thought needed your goods, or that you have been told that they needed your goods, they turn around and tell you, "I am very sorry, but we have just received another shipment, so we will buy your goods, but now we can only offer you half the price you want to sell." This is the fastest path to ruin, and that is why you do not see much of that type of activity in the Empire, along with some other reasons, but we will get to that. But goods and resources still need to be transported, right? So how does that happen in the Empire? This is where the merchants come in. There's a guild of merchants on a local or much larger scale, and they basically act as intermediaries for people who want to move goods and resources. When you have taken the time to establish a commercial network, you have contacts and you can more reliably know the prices at which you can buy and sell remotely, which is beneficial for both the buyer and the seller, since it means that the producer can sell at a higher price than in their area, and the buyer can acquire goods that are not available in their area. The person who earns the most money, of course, is the merchant. Beyond the local Hive City, you will have what I have called the merchant fleet, which are basically the merchant ships of the Imperium, very similar to the Navigator Guild of the Imperium. They are known to be very rich and powerful precisely for this reason, since they are indispensable. No local merchant can afford to maintain their own trade routes. So, it is the merchant fleets that transport large quantities of goods between systems and obtain the greatest benefits in the process. The more complex this becomes, the more merchant agents appear looking for opportunities and investors to contribute to the transportation costs of the goods in exchange for profits. Again, this may or may not be allowed in certain regions, so there is no universal rule. True in most cases. This type of trade usually involves high-end manufacturing orders and bulk raw materials within a star system and a hive city or cluster. Local trade is carried out in the markets and mercantile districts of the hives. These merchant guilds can operate in their local system, depending on how that system is governed and the power of the guild, or they can depend on the merchant fleet. When we think about trade within the Empire, we think mainly about trade between planets in a system, because here there will be some sense of regional economy, although unofficial people have an idea of what can be reliably delivered, and there will be something similar to what I call an unofficial economy, which is formed organically. This, of course, will develop throughout the Empire. The goods that are exchanged at this local level will probably be quite basic, but some hives may specialize in weapons and goods of greater value. Now we have a rough idea of how trade is carried out, but what about currency? Well, as I pointed out, the currency generally accepted as almost universal is what is known as throne geld, and it is known that the throne merchants use it, as do our inquisitors, the mechanicus, and anyone who travels through the galaxy. not only through a local star system. Now, I'm going to make an observation, and I'm sorry because I have to get out of the immersion in the Dark Heresy role-playing game, where it is pointed out that even the guards and other Imperial figures use thrones almost as a basic income. I think this is really debatable. It is certainly possible that this is the case, but I think it is equally possible that they simply needed a monetary system for the game to work, to be able to buy, exchange, and so on. So I take this concept with caution. I'm not entirely sure that this is really how things are. What is much safer is that within local systems throughout the galaxy, thrones are accepted as currency, although there is still no real system to determine their value. So, again, this is not very different from antiquity. If you were traveling, a gold coin could buy a bag of apples in one region, 2 bags of apples in another, or just 1 apple in another. So, although thrones are generally accepted throughout the galaxy, if you need to do that, you may have to try to establish your own sense of whether something is going to be a good exchange or not according to what you understand its value to be. Maybe you're interested in other goods that you have and you can get a better deal through barter. This is still very common throughout the Empire. So it is often not even necessary for money to change hands if you have goods or services to exchange within a local planetary system or a hive, although local currencies have often appeared that are specific to those places and are not generally accepted anywhere else. The value of these currencies is also determined locally, although this type of currency may spread to some extent among the local population, but most of the time it will be used by merchants and suppliers of the wealthy elite who carry out transactions between the planets of a system. But let's get to the point. What about the average commoner on the street? What do they earn? Do they earn anything? The answer is that it is extremely variable. In some worlds, they can simply use precious shells as tokens. In others, their own local currency, based on the rare metals that are there. Some may use something similar to a script or script. They may even use some formal digital currency that is only tracked through cogitators and connect to citizens through biological implants in the arm or hand. Or what if they use all these things? Because that is also possible depending on how the hive or district is organized. I have never seen it specified, but I suppose that in many systems it would be something similar to a serious crime to deface the currency within the empire or try to counterfeit it, because that is quite common when you have currency, since again, in antiquity, when you had literal gold and silver, some people cut very small pieces off their gold and silver tokens, which were essentially proto-currencies, so they could make their own tokens from those small pieces. This is one of the reasons why coins began to be minted, along with other things, to prevent people from abusing the system. So, when you see the marks on these coins, you see that they actually had an important purpose, to ensure that when you gave someone 5 silver coins, you knew that they were worth their value and that they were not cheating you by cutting off 1/10 of each coin. Therefore, I would say that something similar occurs in various regions of the empire to prevent people from being deceived and to guarantee stable local trade, but that is just an idea that has occurred to me. So call it currency, token, credit, voucher. The point is that they will be very difficult to manipulate and replicate, and will probably only have value within the hive and potentially only within a specific sector of a hive, since most of the population of a hive city is not honest and are probably trapped in a system known as company. Scripts are also not explicitly mentioned anywhere. It is just a logical assumption on my part because I think it makes sense, but I want to make it clear that it is not something that is written in the law and is immovable. It is just my way of seeing it, and you will see why I think it is like that. Scripts are basically a substitute for an official currency and are usually distributed by a specific business or company. There are examples of this in the real world, or in our case, in a hive, where they could be distributed by a guild or a clan, or I suppose by a skill depending on how the hive is structured. It is essentially a currency that can only be redeemed within the company you work for or the guild you belong to, and it is very likely that this is how ordinary citizens of a hive city have money to spend. I will bother to point out that it probably works the same for the Imperial Guard, because if you're a guard stationed in a localized region far from any services, you will probably be paid in that, since they themselves will have brought their own services with the camps, the districts, the barracks, and everything they have there. If you move more around the galaxy, maybe yes, then you would be paid in thrones so that you would have a more universal way of buying and trading or whatever when you arrived at certain destinations within a sector or district of the hive, although there will be a store, a bar and other establishments that you would expect, but they will probably also be controlled by the guild or clan of that sector and district. So any credit you earn will go directly back into the guild's pockets. Now, you could save your credits, but if they're very limited as to where they can be spent, your opportunity to really do anything more than work for goods and simply continue to exist is significantly reduced. Now, there will usually be some option to exchange those tokens or credits for a more general currency, such as thrones. However, this is likely to be offered at an exchange rate that is not really favorable to the person who wants to exchange, and furthermore, that exchange rate is not going to be a rate determined independently based on a broader economy. It is much more likely to simply be the one they decide to set. So a vicious circle for the worker, who will probably have a very difficult, if not impossible, time getting out of their extreme poverty. Now, there are variations on this theme, depending on the guild you belong to or the role you play. A guild or clan may divide your salary between Hive credits, resources such as energy, air, water, accommodation, clothing, equipment, etc. This can be optional or not. So maybe you think, hey, this concept of script sounds really terrible. And yes, it is not fantastic, but it seems like the most probable form of payment that will be used both in the Hive Cities and in the Imperial services in general, especially because when using a system like this, it can be easily linked with the administratum and the tithe system. Remember that the Imperium is not going to care that Johnny Guardsman is scammed with his earnings, because he is probably going to be dead tomorrow anyway. The same happens with the administrators or the crew of the Imperial Navy, and so on. But inside a hive, or inside the locality of system, you can find something similar to an administrative script house, where people could cache their scripts. As I have pointed out previously, or this could be a form by which the administration receives scripts from the guilds in bulk that could then be exchanged for the regional currency and perhaps compensate for the contributions of a hive towards an imperial tithe. Essentially, you're counting not only the production, but also the general daily work in your calculation, otherwise something like that. This system has many advantages, but the best of all is that it works not only for civilians, but also for the Imperial Guard. It is probably the most widely used system. The disadvantages are that almost inevitably it is going to generate a black market to acquire goods that are not available, and that is simply inevitable. It is a completely different ballgame. Nor are there any real indications of any type of large-scale institutional banks or anything similar, but again, it is possible that there are trusted merchants who can store large sums of money if you are a rich person or if you occupy a high position in the spire. You probably have very guarded areas where to keep your things, like a family vault, basically. So the answer to the question of whether there is currency in the Imperium is yes and no. There is currency, but generally only at a very specific local level. There is economy, but only in a quite old, medieval feudal sense. There is commerce, and there are merchants, but the role they play varies a lot. If a common citizen of the Hive, or even a merchant, you're not going to do much more than trade between the sectors of the Hive and the people you know locally. Probably for the guilds, for the most part, it will be between the Hive cities of a group and no further than that. The Spire and the Sub-Hive are something like a law in themselves, of course, and the rules of these places are really what anyone. My guess is that if you get caught trying to fake an exchange in the Sub-Hive or scamming someone with fake coins, they will probably cut off your hand or even your face. Now we enter the heart of the matter, the structure of a Hive city. In the period of the 41st millennium, this is not something that can be considered a standard model, but in general they follow some common structural relationships with each other. Of course, this is only a rough generalization, and the conditions, environmental factors, and historical events of each individual hive will have influenced the determination of its structural disposition and its long-term state. Many areas will have been reused over time, or structures will have been added to them at the base of a hive, although some are only 50 miles in diameter, while others extend over many hundreds, if not thousands, of miles in diameter, which generally reduces to about half when the hive needle has begun to narrow towards its core and middle levels, and then steadily decreases as you ascend the needle. The lower middle third will be the most densely populated and busy part of a hive, with all its heavy industry, while the administrative sections and light industry extend from the ground levels to the lower levels within the upper part of the hive. The richest and those with hereditary ties live in what is known as the Needle or the Needles, which are the highest sections of Hive City and are physically separated from the lower levels by a heavy physical barrier. Usually, and there is not necessarily a single needle section, but there may be several, which often have specific local titles and names. Of course, there are guarded transportation systems to allow movement between the lower and upper levels and throughout the Hive City. Finally, there are the underground areas, which are usually collectively called subhive. This is where criminals, exiles, the dishonored are found, but it is not just a few ramshackle huts underground. The subhive is usually almost as wide as the hive at its base level, and from there continues down toward abandoned or sometimes active mining operations or towards factories. The subhive of most hive cities is, to a large extent, a city in itself, and has developed a complex subculture of gangs, guilds, and merchants of its own, although much more anarchic and prone to resolving disputes with casual violence. Throughout the hive, there will be large areas, perhaps even sectors, that will be closed and declared off-limits. This may be because they have become excessively contaminated by the centuries of manufacturing for which they have been used. However, these dark and empty sectors of a hive can be very useful for those who do not wish to be seen or watched. Habitats and factorums are rarely abandoned without a good reason, but some areas will eventually reach a point where they will be too difficult to maintain, either structurally or because they are dangerous or because of the practically non-existent concept of worker safety. The area may have become too saturated with pollution to allow most Hive City workers to operate there. As for the construction and location of the hives, there are certainly oddities built around a strange source of energy that is now considered almost magical to its citizens or engineers, and even to the mechanicus. Others may exist even underwater, having been flooded millennia ago by some extraordinary planetary event, but adapted to be able to continue functioning in some way. Others have been built with materials unknown even to the mechanicus, which leads us to another question that I will address shortly. Some may be entirely dedicated to such as the cult of the Emperor, essentially becoming a gigantic cathedral sanctuary. Some hives are even vast penal colonies with workers dedicated to extremely dangerous manufacturing or mining processes. Others have become vast necropolis hives after suffering an apocalyptic battle long ago and are now dedicated to honoring the dead and the Emperor. Of course, many hives can be a strange mixture of several factors or a combination of them, which is especially true in this late era, in which, for example, the ecclesiarchy, the mechanicus, the sororitas, the Inquisition, etc., that is basically the administrative and military structure of the Imperium, may consider it necessary at any time to requisition a part of a hive city for their own operations, and it would be quite unusual for such a request not to be granted by the ruling nobility of a hive city or by a planetary governor. But, of course, this would always be determined based on the situation. All hive cities are considered of great importance to the Imperium, and, as such, the military forces prepared to defend them are usually significant. The Imperium employs an approach to defending hive cities that could be described as suicidal to the point of madness. They consider hive cities to be the ultimate mark of humanity on a world, and, as such, will deploy any force necessary to defend them against their enemies. That is probably why, although inquisitors, as we have learned, can employ the exterminatus on a world, this is not something that is easily approved, and any destruction of a hive city is a devastating stain on the imperial records. Of course, there are some circumstances in which this last man standing approach does not occur, because the nobles of the hives or the planetary governors, whether out of madness or cowardice, can always put their own interests before those of the Imperium, as sad as it is to believe, or they may simply be taking a more inquisitorial approach and considering that the destruction of a hive may be necessary to save the others in a world. However, this is not the preferred option, which generally consists of saturating any hive that faces the Xenos with human combatants, even if they are left fighting for nothing more than rubble. In fact, on some elevated planets where the Xenos have destroyed hive cities, patrols continue to investigate and scour those ruins every day to purge any remnants of the enemy for many hundreds of years. Mainly, of course, to ensure that there is no possibility of resurgence, especially in the case of the orc and tyrannid species, which are very invasive and can leave their biological seed for decades, if not generations, and then suddenly reappear and devastate a world without warning. Each imperial citadel is a great symbol of the achievements and power of humanity. But in the 41st millennium, they also symbolize the reach and divinity of the emperor. Allowing a hive city to fall without spending significant resources would be a disgrace to the glory of the emperor and the empire, and if that means spending billions of human soldiers to save even the shattered remains of a hive city, so be it. The surroundings of many hives lack any natural life, due to having suffered millennia of pollution and exploitation of resources, which leaves them as little more than wastelands or contaminated ashes, or sometimes irradiated, which are usually called, as is logical, the ashen wastelands. However, some human characters still exist here, either in micro-settlements or in the outer areas of the hive's base, perhaps to recover scrap or materials, or to repair pipes and transport ducts. Many areas can contain hidden rewards in the form of available scrap, or even lost technology. Those who explore the wasteland may even be lucky enough to find, for example, a rich vein of rust or an accumulation of valuable chemicals that have seeped from the bedrock. These deposits are extracted or collected for their return and processing within the hive city. The transport tubes mentioned above are an ancient technology that is not seen in all hive worlds, but in those where they are present, they usually exist to connect groups of hives to each other, that is, multiple hive cities relatively close to each other. These tubes are usually suspended from cables over the wastelands, although sometimes they can also be buried underground. They can be few or many, and a good example is the hive city of Necromunda, where they are often described as resembling something like a spiderweb. Now, the outer surface of a hive city can sometimes appear solid, but in reality it is pierced by several wells and tunnels. These wells are small compared to the volume of the needle in general, but it is where the scarce light enters the hive city, and these tubes and wells also connect with the air processors that we will discuss shortly. The deck is where most tunnels and transport ducts between the needles begin and end, and the tunnel stations, entrance fortresses, enclosures, and garrison blocks are all located on the deck, so they're the best places to contribute to the regulation and defense of the city, as well as to traffic between and within the hives. The deck is also the first line of defense of the hive city active defenses of the hive city against planetary invasions. They often have giant defensive lasers capable of reaching orbital targets and are mounted at many points in the hive city. They are used to defend against human or alien spaceships. The shell is also fundamental to protect the hive city from various environmental conditions, whether it is glass ash thrown against the hive during a storm, solar radiation, blizzards, and all kinds of extreme conditions throughout the galaxy. But I'm sure that some of you are wondering or asking a burning question. How is it possible that if the entire ecological system of a planet, its entire ecological system has collapsed due to the hive cities, how can there be oxygen for these huge populations? This is undoubtedly a difficult but fair question. The short answer is that, for many hives similar to those seen on Mars during its descent into anarchy, there will be a small allocation of mechanicus within most hive cities that will deal with the most complex systems necessary to, perhaps not totally, but for the most part, maintain the population of a hive city. But it must be remembered that most hive worlds will depend on the supply of agricultural worlds, which will cultivate the essential resources for human life using the entirety of these planets as gigantic biological farms, humidity farms, etc., within the hive itself, although every effort will be made to minimize dependence on these resources imported from the empire in general. Therefore, in terms of breathable air, this will vary depending on the hive and its planet. Some hive worlds could still have a very simple ecology, which could be enough to maintain a very basic level of breathable atmosphere. Others, like Necromunda, although its surface is devastated and a contaminated wasteland, it is believed that within the ashen waste that surrounds it and covers the entire surface of the planet, there are still some low levels of life, such as bacteria and algae, and it is speculated that these are capable of producing very minimal levels of oxygen, but enough to provide something to the hive cities. Many citizens of the hives, of course, will simply have adapted to the conditions of their world over many generations, and, therefore, will have physically adapted to lower levels of breathable air, especially considering how they already work in polluted conditions within the manufacturums of the hives, where respirators are often mandatory if they are available. In general, however, the Mechanicus will have an infrastructure that fits the general description of purification processes to help supply breathable air to the population. But this will often also be coordinated with the guilds within the hive city in terms of distribution. Outside air is drawn in through the ventilation ports of the hive deck and then passes through a complex system of purification filters to extract pollutants, which are pumped back into the atmosphere or sometimes used in processes. This mechanical equipment is present, as I've already said, in most hive cities and also maintain the most complex central energy systems, where water treatment facilities, etc. are located, but as I have also said, this can be done in collaboration with various human guilds that are dedicated to specific areas of a city, very similar to what the great feudal cities could do in the ancient history of humanity, where cities could be divided into sectors with a specific guild of the city that was committed to maintaining its own district because, as you can see, in a hive city, the idea of centralized control was mostly abandoned a long time ago. And now, what is formed within most hives is something like a decentralized form of feudal government, in which the ruling nobles of the hives can override decisions in general when necessary, but without needing to get involved in the daily affairs of the hive sectors, while the planetary governors oversee things for the broader bureaucracy of the empire, intervening or making demands only when necessary, and, of course, we're going to have several institutions and representatives that are spread throughout the hive monitoring what is happening in general. Next, we come to the central heart of all hive cities, where you will find what are known as heat sinks. These are basically vertical wells that descend from the highest levels of a hive in the needle to the habitable levels, passing through the subhive and reaching the geology of the planet itself. These heat sinks can be kilometers in diameter in some parts, and are usually built with dense layers of plastisteel. They have several service access points, chambers, etc. built in to allow inspection and maintenance of the heat sink, as their importance usually decreases as you descend, and if access points exist, these will be heavily sealed behind huge adamantium doors, probably under permanent surveillance, as you can never be sure who might find a lost or compromised access point and the potential for it, once discovered, to be exploited or cause disruption to those seeking such disorder becomes very dangerous. But what is a heat sink exactly? Well, the idea is quite simple. It is about taking the geothermal heat from the planet and converting it into energy for the city and the needle. So throughout the needle stations will be generated that will be used to convert this heat into usable energy, and this energy is transmitted to factories, housing levels, etc. These heat sink generators are usually controlled by guilds or clans, whose various levels of habitability and maintenance are very important, but this also means that they can use this as a source of power and gives them great control over the population located in their area, because if you want energy, you must make sure that the guild or clan that controls that generator allows it to you. Other groups may control the connection points of the electrical grid and demand something more like a toll to ensure the smooth transmission of energy to a sector within some hive cities. This provides something in a small-scale economy, but in other hives, this system of decentralized power over the sectors is not tolerated at all, where they lean towards a more controlled and centralized government system, which probably fits better with the general functioning of the Imperium, but as I have said, it is very different and dispersed depending on the hive you are in, although some hive cities are governed by people who have very little interest in what happens in the lower. In the upper spiral, this type of control over energy systems is much less likely, as the ruling noble family will maintain control and armed troops will protect any generating station. It will be highly regulated and part of the more structured nature of the upper spirals of the hive, but it should be noted that although almost all hives use a heat sink to regulate temperature and energy, There are often additional sources of energy within the manufacturing areas or even in the habitable sections of a city. Some of these energy sources can be really strange and even unknown, and they continue to function within the Mechanicus, who do not want to make too many changes, given the possibility that something goes terribly wrong and destroys the entire city. Some also depend on nuclear energy to operate areas of the city or energy manufacturers built during the era of the Imperium or when the Mechanicum was still establishing forge worlds throughout the galaxy. Most of the lower levels of the Hive will be dedicated to industrial processes, although various more specialized facilities may exist throughout the city and up to the spire. Obviously, if these exist within the upper spire, they will probably be more advanced processes and may involve levels of things like DNA augmentation, bioengineering facilities designed even to prolong the lives of those who hold high-ranking positions or the nobility. In the factory levels, things are quite different. The scale of manufacturing of most hives is a necessity, along with the production of citizens to deliver products to the Imperium in exchange for food and other materials necessary to maintain these vast populations. Many factories that exist on the lower periphery of the Hive City and at ground level will continuously pump pollutants, and if the city is not limited by an outer wall, or even if it were, over time these pollutants will accumulate and solidify, allowing the ashen material from the outside, or whatever situation the world is in, to grow more. It could be a dense jungle, it could be ice, whatever. Over the centuries, this can create a problem in which the lowest factories are gradually submerged by the exterior material, and once unable to pump out their pollutants, they will essentially become unviable for production. So, similarly to energy generation, manufacturing will also be controlled in part by guilds or clans, and although it will depend on how a hive city is organized and governed, we can already observe that this varies significantly between planets. Now, this seems like a good time to make a small side note, and I say small because we're talking about the planetary organization related to hive cities. Many may mistakenly assume that the way we see the Empire at its highest level is filtered and replicated in all its galactic sectors, its systems, and its worlds. In a sense, this is not entirely incorrect, since we know that the Empire is not really concerned with deploying its maximum authority when it deems it necessary through the Inquisitor or any of its high-level representatives. However, it should be noted that most worlds, for the most part, are left to their own devices, as I have said, and this means that there is not what we might consider a standardized or imposed system of government within the Imperium that makes decisions for the systems and worlds. Of course, there is the administrator who is in charge of keeping a record of what is happening, who needs what and where, and what comes in and out. But as long as the planet delivers its tributes and materials to the Imperium in general and does not find any major problems with the Xenos or within its population, they're more or less left to their own devices, because the Imperium does not care. Furthermore, most planets have some imperial representation within their hive, as I said before, the ecclesiarchy, etc., so it's not as if many hive cities and their planets could really do anything without it being noticed soon. Of course, it must be remembered that, due to the very nature of the Empire and its other factions, departments, and organizations, there are some established restrictions that will influence any decision that is made. This means that most worlds lean towards a more vertical power structure, with a single leader for a planet, and, as I have pointed out before, something like a governor, an imperial representative, a high-ranking noble will hold this position. However, it would be unusual for a hive city or even a planetary system to be governed by something more like a council of representatives or even a parliament. There are some precedents for this within the Imperium, and the Mechanicum already basically had in the pre-heresy era, but now it would be unlikely that those members would be elected by the citizens, as that is not how the Imperium generally works. It would take time and resources to educate the citizenry, and those are things that are not considered a valuable use of time or resources. Furthermore, the very concept of a council implies that, by its nature, there should be a sense that said council can make decisions about what should, can, or cannot happen. Now, in a broader sense, this again goes against the way the Imperium works, since they normally tell you what is going to happen, and you better do it or you'll be replaced, or, worse still, we will go back to square one, to what I was saying at the beginning about the different planets and the hive cities that are governed. You could have something like a council of representatives that only represented different sectors within an upper city, but rather to facilitate a coordinated understanding of production, report on dangerous problems, lazy workers, or rumors of discontent, etc., that must be suppressed. Then, that council could be supervised by a higher-level representative, who would almost certainly be a person in a position of authority, if not appointed by the Imperium, then certainly with the understanding that whatever their decisions, they must be first and foremost in the best interest of the Imperium, and secondly all other considerations. I would compare any council structure within a hive city to the concept of the Inquisition. So a member of the Hive Council would probably be chosen from, for example, the oldest members of a clan or a guild, and would act more as a spokesperson to facilitate the smooth functioning of the hive's activities and the preservation of their own group, rather than to defend personal opinions. But in general, they would not have any level of special power beyond that, and would be more of a symbolic gesture of cooperation than anything else. Returning to manufacturing within a hive, as factories rise and fall over the centuries, guilds and clans, or even what we might consider organizations, will gain or lose power and territory, which can sometimes lead to conflicts and territorial disputes over resources, power, and facilities. Acts of sabotage could be seen, and, in extreme cases, this could even occur between hive cities on a planet if there were noble houses facing each other with vendettas between them and trying to make rival cities appear ineffective or unable to deliver their resources to the Imperium. In some cases, this could even lead to a small civil war, although, as in the Inquisition, tolerance for this type of event would be very minimal. So few would risk such an open conflict, as they would know that the end result would probably be the intervention of the Imperium and the abolition of the nobility, which would be replaced by a selected imperial governor, which is not what they want in the lower levels. However, these endless disputes over production and facilities are one of the causes of gang wars, although not at such a violent or flashy level as is seen in the sublevels of the production areas, where it is more like groups of workers who brutally beat their rivals or carry out sabotage to secure more work and more hive credits. Now you can imagine these types of worker gangs, perhaps with a color tied to their sleeve or neck or something like that, to indicate which group they belong to. Over time, the factories that remain completely buried by these ashen moors will be abandoned, will deteriorate, and very often will collapse under the weight of the new pollution that is pumped above them, continuing this cycle again, now very gradually over millennia. What this means is that the hive has to grow, and this may also mean that the subhive will become increasingly large. So for many hive cities, the subhive is already a vast cavernous kingdom that is slowly becoming an almost mirror image of the upper hive, although extremely polluted, violent, and gloomy. It is not uncommon for unstable buildings to collapse and fall into ruin, often with workers still inside. However, if these structures have no obvious need, the bodies and equipment are simply discarded and left to scavengers, animal or human, who crawl in the dark dirt of the pipes and shadows, waiting for any chance to tear off some rotten remains. It is quite common to see buildings in ruins even on the main public roads that are usually very busy in a hive city, and over time they're given new use, using the old site as foundations, as has happened for millennia in the center of the hive, above the most polluted and noisy factories and forges, where the habitable levels are now located. These are, of course, the levels where the vast majority of the citizens of a hive live and also work. The quality of these can range from semi-luxury for high-ranking members of the guilds to appalling misery, similar to a shanty town or worse, for those who have no job or purpose. Where citizens and their families live will obviously be relative to their position both as workers and socially, just as in any standard human civilization, with the best accommodations for the wealthy elite and the lower levels for workers and the indigent. The spire exists outside the normal sphere due to the luxury of these upper areas. There's probably a good reason why these sections for the nobles of a hive city are practically inaccessible to the lower levels, since if the common workers realized how badly they are treated, it could be enough to trigger some kind of rebellion. Although, if it arose, it would be crushed almost instantly by the uncompromising militant forces operating on behalf of the empire before they could really take control, which would be very dangerous. But this also answers a common question that I see being asked. Why do people tolerate living in those conditions? And again, the answer is that sometimes they don't. But when it comes to a civilization that can easily withstand the loss of millions of people in a single battle without batting an eye, the idea of purging a hive sector of tens or hundreds of thousands of rebellious citizens is not something that is going to keep anyone awake at night. They will simply deal with and quell those rebellions. If the situation deteriorates further, the Imperial Guard will take control. So yes, from time to time, there will be attempts to overthrow the powers that be. It is the normal order of human civilization, only they almost always fail, and if the situation ever really got out of control, it would never get worse than a hive city purged with a combined force of the Guard and perhaps a support force of something like Astartes scouts, sororitas, etc. Of course, the suppression of the rebellion would be coordinated and would serve to maintain the quality of life for the nobility in the spire. Imported products, uncontaminated food, clean air. The High Spire is for the nobility, truly a paradise of luxury below the physical barrier that separates those above from those below. Although this existence is almost an alternative reality for the daily life of the average citizen. Below the spire, the light is dim in many areas. It is rather a perpetual twilight, with only the luminous globes illuminating the labyrinth of corridors. Citizens breathe only recycled or processed air from the toxic outer atmosphere, and food is often overprocessed, recycled, or extracted from the bodies of those who no longer need feeding. The universal synthetic diet extracts proteins and minerals and reuses them in the form of corpse starch blocks, with a not-so-subtle name. At least there are no illusions about what you get. It is often rumored among the citizens of the hive that the air and water have probably passed through at least several hundred people before reaching you, although this is obviously quite unquantifiable. But then, as we continue down, you come, of course, to the subhive. As I've already mentioned, the subhive is a vast, lawless kingdom that exists below the surface and directly under the hive city. There may still be operations within it connected to the upper levels, for example, resource mining, some storage areas near ground level, but below it, where materials and hardware are stored for the Station Imperial Guard, among other things. Then, of course, there are elements of the hive's infrastructure, such as the heat sink, and for this reason, the upper sections of the subhive will probably be patrolled to some extent by heavily armed and armored Arbeits forces. As I have mentioned before, any critical infrastructure will have heavy guard forces permanently stationed there, along with reserves. The upper areas of a subhive, close to the surface, will still be rudimentary and very similar to a disorganized slum, although, depending on the specific characteristics of each hive city, these may be more or less orderly. Some will be very violent, in a state of continuous struggle for power, but basically living in anarchy, while others could be relatively orderly, more like a kind of border town where there is minimal official law enforcement, but where local groups have taken it upon themselves to maintain a certain order because they simply consider it preferable, even if it is according to their own definition of punishments. One thing is certain. The deeper one goes into the underworld, the more dangerous and abominable it becomes, while the upper area contains buildings and industries of relatively recent history. The lowest parts of the underworld date back to a very distant past, and these ruins are probably a mixture of factories, but also mixed with the true forgotten cities that were the original basis for the Hive City. They were probably built during the dark age of technology, but now they look nothing like that era, as they have been torn apart for thousands of years by people who did not understand the masterful technology they were destroying. In the lowest levels of the subhive, it is possible that among the deep tunnels, now filled with highly contaminated water that dissolves almost everything it touches, are the last remains of the colonial ships that were first used to explore the galaxy, the ships that humanity sent during its golden age from old Earth and that were scrapped by the original settlers to build their new homes. And this is where the tempting possibility lies of finding remains of STC, or who knows what treasures could be unearthed. However, this area is often extremely unstable, given the crushed material and collapsed ruins that make up what is known as the sump. Reaching these highly contaminated depths, even for a team from the Mechanicus and the forces that accompany it, is extraordinarily dangerous. For one thing, These areas are now far below the surface of the planet, hidden among a maze of extremely violent and heavily armed gang territories, not to mention all sorts of environmental hazards and strange mutant creatures. It is even said that there are small settlements of humans who have learned to cope with the environmental horrors and the ruins of the Age of Conflicts, who live in the shadows and have an intuitive knowledge of all these kinds of environmental effects and dangers within the subhive. In the upper and middle levels of the subhive, there are many gangs that are simply brutal thugs who crush the skulls of anyone who opposes them. But there are others who have surprising access to technology, and although these are still actively involved in trade with the upper levels, there are also the guilds, bounty hunters, merchants, slavers, etc. The subhive is truly a region rich in scum, and it is this that, of course, is largely focused on Necromunda. I will start to explore this in more detail as we move forward, because, as with 40k, this continues to expand and build, and it is an area of the universe that I have always liked, because the great galactic battles between superhuman warriors and almost invincible alien machines are one thing. But the small gangs fighting to the death in a toxic wasteland hoping that their last shotgun bullet will blow off their weapon and tear off their arm is also, in some way, very attractive, not to mention the other crazed characters that exist, like, I don't know, a character capable of riding a giant zombie rat god. So I'm really looking forward to expanding more on the information about the gangs, what happens, and the individuals who live in the subhive. Although life in the subhive may seem distressing and meaningless, those who live there are not doomed to remain there forever. Many do so by their own choice to evade the justice of the upper levels of the hive. And this is one of the reasons why the subhives are saturated with fugitives, outcasts, mutants, and heretics of various heretical degrees. Not to mention, of course, the occasional appearance of contaminated xenos, such as the gene stealer cults, for those in the main hive. However, those who choose to live in the subcenters are hardly considered human by the members of the upper hive who live within the limits of the Imperium, and especially by those who live in the spires. The inhabitants of the subcenters are considered little more than vermin, and, for many, probably not even that, but a plague that must be exterminated. A plague that must be exterminated. So the Arbites patrols and the nobles of the spires that descend into the darkness do not neglect at all what happens below. This makes the subhives of the Hive Cities not only one of the most dangerous places to live in the Imperium, but also the origin of some of the most appalling brutalities. Despite this, there is never a shortage of people willing to live there, because despite all its dangerous horrors, the tortuous conditions, and any other problem from many thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, or even millions of humans who descend to the subhive, it is still preferable to living under the oppression of the Imperium, because at least in the subhive one enjoys a relative spectrum of freedom, although probably not for long. However, there is a ray of hope for those who live in the subhive, and it is for those who are able to withstand its conditions, who try to move within the extremely vague limits of what is acceptable. And only those who are the most ruthless and cunning always have a very remote chance of achieving redemption or ascending to the lower, slightly less lethal subhive. It may seem strange, but it must be remembered that some Astartes recruit in the feral worlds due to their keen sense of survival and combat skills. This is similar in the subhive, although it is not especially common. But some of the inhabitants of the subhive may be of an age that makes them attractive candidates for the Astartes. They are usually hardened in combat from an early age and are open-minded enough to be easily molded if given the opportunity to become superhuman warriors of the Imperium instead of a miserable and brief death in the chemical pits of a hive city. I think if someone gave you those two options, it would be very easy to know which one you would choose. Now, it doesn't have to be Astartes, although many hive cities contain in the upper levels what is known as a progenium erudite, and that is where the fanatics are hardened to hold positions in the Imperial Guard or other branches of the Imperial Service. So even there, in the lower levels, candidates can be chosen. Well, to say choose is more like hitting them until they are unconscious and waking them up in a barracks telling them that that is what they're going to do, you're going to do now. But in any case, the subhives can be a very fertile ground for some of their highest status individuals, whose early life was tempered to reach the perfect skill set by the worst conditions and the terrible needs of human survival in its purest form. which one would expect that at least someone somewhere would be able to appreciate the irony that 5 cities are sometimes called arcology. In my opinion, this term should only be applied loosely in relation to Hive cities, if at all. I think I myself used this description in the past, and if I did, I would now retract it and clarify why. When I thought back to the Hive cities, the first thing I thought was, oh, it's a big autonomous city, it's an arcology. Well, no, because you see, an arcology is not completely incorrect. It is simply not a particularly good definition. The main reason is that the fundamental concept of what is known as arcology, although it is a large structure that contains housing, industry, and, in general, everything we consider necessary for a city to function, contained in a massive structure, and you should know that it is not really necessarily just industry, but work, but this joins the concept that by design, an arcology is intended to minimize the human impact on both its environment and the environment, none of which could be said to be true in a hive city. In fact, most imperial hive cities are unable to even provide the basic needs of the citizens who live in them, which is usually another characteristic of what would be defined as an arcology, which must be self-sufficient. Imperial hive cities are generally unable to be self-sufficient due to the enormous size of the population, which also puts a great strain on all infrastructure and resources. If you think about it a little more, a hive city is, in most cases, completely the opposite of an arcology. The only thing they have in common is that they are large artificial structures that contain a lot of people, and that is where the comparison ends. In many hive worlds, the planet itself has suffered to the point of death as a result of the obscene populations it was forced to try to sustain. In many hive worlds, they have almost always been dedicated to industrial processes or have suffered a complete ecological collapse millennia ago. This is due, at least in part, to the fact that a planet contains multiple hive cities, or what are known as hive clusters. It is definitely worse in these worlds, and it does not mean that all the worlds where hives exist lack an ecological system that continues to function, since if so, most of the imperial worlds in the galaxy would be dead planets, and that is not the case. On the contrary, an arcology is a utopian and idealistic futuristic vision of human habitation, designed to meet all the needs of its citizens efficiently, optimizing space and having a minimal impact on its environment in all aspects. If we compare all that with what an imperial hive city is, it is very clear that the comparison does not fit at all. So, was there ever a time in humanity's past when hive cities were what we would consider arcologies today? That, my friends, is the right question. A hive city of the Imperium could be better described at this time as a megastructure. Of course, hives are not a single structure. It is simply how they look externally due to their size. So we could consider a term such as megaconurbation to refer to a development in which we have areas of habitation that expand until they eventually merge into a large town or city, or, in the case of hive cities, into an urban megastructure. Not all hive cities necessarily started as small towns or cities that spaced out and built organically. They certainly began structurally as a collection of basic structures planned in the golden age of humanity, perhaps domes, etc., and then they were built until someone or something decided that the best option was to build upwards and not outwards. Hive cities now exist as conglomerates of endless overlapping structures, stacked structures built with heavy rock, creek, and plasteel, so high in some worlds that their towering spires have begun to pierce the highest layers of the planet's atmosphere. But the first foundations of these habitable zones were laid many thousands of years ago, although, of course, it is entirely debatable when exactly this occurred. But if you think about it, the great concept of what an arcology represents seems to fit more into the perspective of the golden age of humanity, that is, the dark age of technology, than in the age of the Imperium, because in the 41st millennium, the well-being of citizens and the environmental impact are not especially important on the agenda of the imperial administratum. On the other hand, if this were the case, one could imagine that hive cities would surely not be as gloomy and ruinous as they are now. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. It is worth remembering that the war with the Iron Men, aggravated by the Age of Conflicts, which by the way lasted approximately 5,000 years, completely annihilated a large part of the achievements and culture of humanity. So it is not unreasonable to imagine how, over some 5 millennia, a period during which many worlds, if not most, were subjected to apocalyptic wars, internal conflicts, and atrocious massacres, humanity fell back into the darkest periods of tribal barbarism and low technology. So it is almost to be expected that these structures, if they have not suffered significant damage, have at least been widely reused and stripped of materials that could serve for war or for peripheral settlements. Now, at this point, I will point out that the descriptions about the origin of the Hive Cities in terms of construction and materials used make the picture very confusing. This is always the problem with the 40k universe. There are many things that seem contradictory or take you down different paths. Half of the puzzle consists of reaching your own conclusion based on what is available and discarding references that do not seem to fit. In this case, personally, I have not reached a clear enough conclusion about it because Hive Cities are sometimes described as if they had only been completely built after the Golden Age, but that does not make sense since other evidence and the logical context point to the fact that they were largely built during the Golden Age. First, let's explore further, and then I'll give you my final opinion on the subject. So here we come to the key point of all these debates about the origin, the STC designs. There is only one period in which the STC designs originate, and clear reference is made to the fact that some areas of a hive city in the middle level of the structural space of the spire of a hive are designed according to the STC guidelines. This may mean two things, of course. It suggests to us that hive cities can be easily established in the middle of the dark age of technology, since this was the period in which we know that STC designs were produced, neither before nor after, although, as I say, the defenders of this theory defend this period, which we find very confusing. On the other hand, perhaps it only means that they have found an STC in terms of construction and are using it within a hive city, although, as I've said repeatedly, I've only found a few references to this, not many, so, as I always say, you have to take it with caution, since the references are important, but so is the context, and it seems quite logical that, when placed in context, structures such as hive cities make logical sense, and originated in a period in which humanity apparently operated with a standardized system throughout the galaxy. This would undoubtedly also help us to explain why hive cities are so surprisingly widespread. It also makes sense if we take into account the scarce details we know of the Golden Age, that in this era there was a very advanced technological level, and that, even if we give the Imperium a fairly wide margin, I would say that it is very debatable that they had the general knowledge to build such vast towers throughout the galaxy. We know that they can build large machines like Titans, they can create enormous defenses, they can create ships that travel through the galaxy, so they can create all these things. However, many of them still originate in the dark age of technology. So, as I say, I wonder if they could do it on such a large scale, while on the other hand, within the Golden Age, the concept of creating a properly functioning arcology seems quite plausible and also fits into their vision of the world, at least, according to what we can estimate. It simply seems more logical that that was the case, especially if we take into account that many of these settlers arrived in worlds that, in my opinion, at least initially, would want to concentrate their population to a large extent. Because let us remember that this is not a disorganized group of frontier settlers seeking to create the Wild West and claim a piece of land. They were a very advanced population, both ideologically and technologically, and they traveled to new worlds with the specific purpose of colonizing them. So dividing themselves all over the planet seems a very unlikely option for them. In fact, according to speculations about humans and futurism, it is debatable whether humans in the Golden Age would still have concepts such as individual private ownership of land and materials, etc. So it may simply have been the operation with their STC system, which, as we know, seems very likely to have been a form of advanced AI, in addition to being something similar to an automated production system similar to a 3D printer, plus any other help that humans had at that time in the form of stone men and gold men, whatever they may be. What I mean is that they had a lot of help. The truth is that we don't really know to what extent humans participated in the planning or even in the general decision-making in this early era. It is very possible that they simply let their automated systems decide, knowing that they would choose the most efficient plans and with the best intention for the comfort and safety of humans. This would also help to explain why hive cities are not common in, for example, feudal worlds, which are also known as night worlds. Now, at a very basic level, one could simply say that it is because hive cities are very based on technology and feudal worlds are not. Now, I'm not sure that it is a very obvious conclusion, since a very important part of the context is also omitted, so allow me another small digression. There was a period, even during the Golden Age, in which some parts of humanity apparently began to decide to turn their backs and discard their dependence on artificial intelligence and high technology over time, not initially, but over time. Then they turned to a simpler way of life, which turned out to be a rather wise decision in the long term, and the reason why many nocturnal feudal worlds escaped the worst of the age of conflicts, since many were able to survive quite intact until the age of the Imperium. However, despite their abandonment of technology, there was a time when they produced things probably according to STC designs, which are now known as Imperial Knights. So these population defenders seemed to be senior officials of their colony, but this ended up becoming the feudal system in the form of noble families, since the pilots of the powerful knight machines formed noble houses that still exist today in the Imperium. This was the result of their mental interface with the spirit of the knight's machines, but in any case, this rejection of technology seems to be the most likely reason why in feudal world hive cities are not very common. If they exist in some form, they are rather a basic state of development, probably adapted a long time ago and far from the type of high technology. And they look more like something I would like to see in the classic creation of Mervyn Peake, Gormenghast, now tangent within a tangent. Search for Gormenghast along with the novels Titus Groan and Titus Alone. For those of you who are on the Audible train, it is available there. Now tangential within a tangent. Search for Gormenghast along with the novels Titus Groan and Titus Alone. For those of you who are on the Audible card, it is available there in about 5 hours each. Anyway, the point is that hive cities do not usually appear in feudal and night worlds, but they do appear widely in almost all other worlds of the Imperium, as I pointed out above, appearing as regularly as in 85% of the Imperial worlds. This is not a figure that is due to random decisions in different places, when there are such large distances between worlds. Even so, as I said before, I have not yet decided exactly what my position is on this. It is very difficult to say when hive cities were widely built, but in general I would tend to think that they were at least very advanced before the age of conflicts, because it seems quite clear to me that it was a widely adopted and planned design for a different era. And since the vast majority of the designs used by the Imperium have a similar origin, which are the STC products of the Dark Age, it is logical to think that hive cities also, and I want to emphasize this at a basic level, or a product of the AISD design, and that, although they no longer function by definition as a true arcology and have essentially rotted over millennia into a cadaverous parody of their original glory, even in the modern period described within the Imperium, some cities and some worlds will grow so much that they will concentrate in huge urban sectors until they overlap as a conurbation and, eventually, begin to expand upwards. This is described, but in my estimation, the time before the Empire is more precisely the origin of the hive cities, especially if we take into account that some hive cities have been pointed out by the Mechanicus as being built with materials on their external surfaces that are unknown and unidentifiable to them. This should lead us to conclude that the materials were built in a period in which humanity had considerably more knowledge than now, because no Xenos would lend help to humans to build a city that can only proceed from our distant past, and that is probably the real key. It is a common story in the hive cities that their original foundations are found deep in the underground region, now known as the subcolumnar, and the most ruinous and criminal sector of the hive cities actually holds the deepest secrets of all. As I said before, expeditions to this section of a hive are very dangerous, as they are extremely violent places, often populated not only by the most brutal human elements, but also by strange creatures and mutant tribes. There is, however, the possibility that in the lowest levels of a hive city somewhere in the Imperium, there may be very important remains, even technology, that tell us about humanity's oldest history. Knowing all this, It seems a true tragedy that in their day they were beacons of human achievement, protected by a powerful divine armament that humanity possessed during its technological peak. Who can imagine now what these imposing cities must have been like? Were they basic and practical structures, or were they covered in glass or some composite material to make them look like true beacons of power and light and the ultimate achievement, perhaps not very different from the Eldar worlds during their time of glory before the fall? The living cities were, without a doubt, long ago, a literal pinnacle of achievement, but now all that remains are shattered and rotten structures, a symbol of both what we were and what we are now. The disparity between the two should be very disturbing, but as very few people in the Imperium will ever know of the ancient glory of humanity, is a comparison that few will be able to take the time to contemplate or consider. Now, the rather depressing side of the Hive Cities is that, as I pointed out earlier, the area surrounding them will have been reduced to nothing more than what would appear to be an apocalyptic wasteland devoid of even the most minimal levels of biological life. These ashes and wastelands that surround the Hive Cities are truly a tragedy to behold, as they long ago suffered a total ecological collapse, and perhaps for the entire planet. Music. This is compounded by many more millennia of pollution. They are chemically saturated lands, extremely hostile to any form of life. The composition of these ashes and wastelands can vary significantly from planet to planet. There are some elements that are commonly found, such as microplastics and inorganic chemicals. The conditions almost always corrode metals in a relatively short period of time, and their toxicity is enough to kill almost anything. But, as always, there are variations. Some planets, for example, may be so large that they are partially able to manage the toxic waste from the Hive Cities, while others may exist in different strange conditions if the hives are based on what would be a mostly oceanic world or an icy world, etc. However, in general, having at least a section of the planet that is a destroyed desert wasteland is one of the most common cases in hive worlds, which makes sense if you consider the effect of a huge population over time. This is one of the reasons why Terra is now an ecumenopolis, but very remarkable that for any PDF or Imperial Guard who has to defend their hive city while suffering the external environmental conditions, it is obviously not a particularly favorable situation for humans. So, even a modest assault on a hive city can be quite problematic, as the human defenders suffer significant casualties just from the passive environmental conditions and temperatures, not to mention the effect that can also have on their morale. Some wastelands surrounding a hive city can be so dangerous that they are used as a form of capital punishment, either because the temperatures are so high that they burn the skin of the body in a matter of minutes before suffering a total collapse of the organism, or because the cold is so intense that the result is practically the same, only at the opposite end of the scale. In some wastelands, the material is so abrasive that it can blind in a matter of seconds and cut the flesh into strips. Other hive cities will be surrounded by a toxic fog of chemical pollutants that, when expelled into the wasteland, will lead the condemned to die of asphyxiation or, worse, those pollutants will attack the body and dissolve it almost completely from within. Once the pollutants have entered the body, the worst fate is likely to be for those who are thrown into hive cities surrounded by hundreds of kilometers of highly irradiated wastelands. Sometimes this may be mild and be only the result of past wars that have degraded over time, but in the most serious cases, some immense disaster of the past involving nuclear material has caused pockets of very extreme radiation that persist for those who are forced to go out into these invisible minefields. At first, they may think that they have escaped the worst, that they have only been sent into exile and have not suffered a more brutal fate, but in reality, it will not take them long to start seeing how their skin turns red and black, generally feeling very bad, and in a matter of days their bone marrow will die, followed by the rest of their body, which will essentially disintegrate. They are condemned to a very agonizing death, only comparable to the worst punishments of the chaos deity Nurgle. Although the most toxic areas of waste tend to be concentrated around the city for obvious reasons, beyond this, the waste extends for many thousands of kilometers, if not covering the entire planet itself, in ashen deserts. Unfortunately, most of the time, this tends to be quite typical of a world that contains many hive cities, and is certainly the norm for those that contain hive clusters. That said, some deserts around a hive can, curiously, still contain life, even if it is a strange xeno-life, but life after all. In the ashen deserts of some hive worlds, although the most complex life became extinct long ago, basic algae, bacteria, and fungi can still be found, although it is usually important to point out that these can also be quite aggressive, and one of the reasons why humans who decide to venture into the wastelands usually stay in habitable areas separate from the internal populations of the hives, where they run the risk of spreading some type of biological contamination. One of the most extreme dangers of being in the wastelands are, of course, the dust and ash storms themselves that plague the planets. It has even been reported that some hive cities have been almost buried by the worst of these storms, and at least some are believed to have been as well and were lost long ago in their early stages of development. Because of this, these lost hives are now impossible to detect, as they have been buried deep underground. I like to imagine that there's a remote possibility that, even if the population perished long ago, there may be primitive hive cities containing a wide range of Dark Age technology somewhere, buried in a hive world, waiting to be unearthed even now, under thousands of years of surface matter for the current living members of the hive cities. However, ashes and storms are dangerous not only because they can be very disorienting for those who can or simply must work in these conditions, but also because the storms themselves lift all the deposited material which, as we have already learned, can be extremely dangerous just when it is on the ground. Without adequate protection in a sandstorm, it can mean that a person is literally stripped of their flesh to the bone in a matter of minutes, leaving nothing more than a bleached skeleton and the rags that once covered it. Undoubtedly, in some hive worlds, this will again be a punishment in itself. You may see some kind of pillared structures dotting the wasteland around a hive city, where the condemned are placed and left to the mercy of the sand until they are reduced to a skeleton that will then fall into a pile of worn bones. The conditions are so harsh that it can even be worse than that, and there are not even bones left. Every part of you is reduced to dust beyond the individual level. However, ash storms in some worlds can be a very serious threat, not only to these rebellious individuals, but to the hive cities themselves. The conditions are so extreme that entire exterior sectors of hives, which are usually quite well protected with reinforced materials, are known to have been razed, and it has even been reported that some hives were compromised and destroyed by storms that lashed the planet for centuries and culminated in an apocalyptic storm that sweeps everything in its path. In some hive worlds, the discarded remains of the base or intermediate levels of hives that have suffered such destruction are periodically revealed by the moving oceans of ash, only to be hidden again for many centuries. Necromunda stands out among these worlds. Imperial scholars believe that these residues have currents and tides of other underground contaminants that rise from the planet's bedrock, forming underground currents that displace these wastes like an ocean. In other areas where contaminants rise and cover the surface, they can dry out and form what looks like a dry lake bed, hard enough to walk on. But these are often environmental hazards, as beneath the seemingly safe surface lies a deep sea of ash and dust, like quicksand that will swallow anyone who incorrectly steps on the thinnest parts of these deceptive landforms. Music. The hive cities are, of course, fascinating in themselves for their design, their broader purpose, and their historical development, becoming one of the main places of settlement for the human population at the end of the 41st millennium. However, as curious as they are as a place, the most interesting thing is to know the people who inhabit these vast spaces, and this is a topic that could be talked about a lot. So today I will limit myself to offering an overview, starting with the highest. The highborn are basically the elitist families that rule the hive cities and, in general, the imperial worlds. They are decadent, rich, often maddened, and undoubtedly very disconnected from the reality of those who live literally beneath them. They breathe pure air, eat imported food, spend their vacations in paradisiacal and lush worlds, and hardly have any needs. Most members of the elite will have been born into this life of luxury and, having known nothing different, have developed extremely twisted concepts of humanity, ethics, and morals. It is fair to say that, in general, they are not well liked by many who serve the Empire. Their lives are very comparable to those of ancient royalty, since most of the time they face political intrigues, personal revenge campaigns, murders to obtain status, marriages, illicit affairs, decadent parties, and any number of much worse crimes that would probably be classified as heresy. They were discovered in the lower part of the hive, and they are usually self-centered, ignorant about the things that matter most, and power-hungry. All of them character flaws that pose a triple threat and a warning sign for the Inquisition, which would do everything possible to keep its undercover agents inside the hive spires to hear what they are plotting. If there was ever a very fertile breeding ground for the cults of Slaanesh, the hive spires would be the ideal place. Compared to the average worker, the nobles of the spires will be relatively well educated about their own lineage and some history of the Empire, but they will also be reminded that they are the best examples of imperial citizens. Of course, they will learn about the economy of wealth, commercial policy, and power, not to mention the continuous personal tutoring of their families in the fine arts of social murder. How to finish off an opponent with a wit as sharp as a razor, how to set a verbal trap to belittle your enemies in public, etc. Not all of them are, of course, disgusting and spoiled brats. Some will have the means to pass themselves off as potential candidates, even for not all of them are, of course, disgusting and spoiled brats. Some will have the resources to present themselves as potential candidates, even for the Inquisition, and may infiltrate other hive spires to report to their masters what is happening. Some hive nobles will be directly linked to the events of a hive world, be it a sanctuary world, a mining operation, a shopping center, or an astral military bastion, which will influence to some extent the inhabitants of the hive spire. And, as a result, they may be a little less or a little more corrupt and immoral, which will generally be relative to how the Empire sees them. In a backward mining world that only generates wealth through lucrative or commercial activities, things will probably get pretty ugly, but in an imperial military bastion world, it will be more difficult to keep hidden the disgusting murderous campaigns against rival descendants or questionable trade agreements. Now, the so-called Spearos can also occasionally appear in the subhives. As its name indicates, the Spearos are noble members of the upper hives, usually young, who tend to prove their worth by eradicating some undesirable parasites. They wear very advanced hunting suits, possibly even from the Dark Age, which are manufactured outside the world. Its origin is unknown, although a reasonable assumption is that it is something related to Jakiro. Sometimes these suits are similar to exosuits and provide high levels of protection, firepower, and camouflage, as they engage in one of the most repugnant and decadent activities, human hunting. The hive nobles would say that this is a rite of initiation and that, in addition, it serves to eliminate the worst elements of a hive city. To some extent, this may be true, but it seems almost certain that there is a darker side to Spiro hunting and that, in some hives, it becomes something more like a competitive sport and, most likely, involves excessive levels of betting, with the possibility even of being broadcast live to the high spire. In general, the activities of a Spearos are probably much more disturbing than a simple, occasional ancestral initiation rite. It may seem surprising, but several chapters of Space Marines actually maintain a form of structure in the hive worlds that they consider of critical tactical importance or simply useful for recruitment. Of course, their home planet does not count here, since in that world they will be everywhere, but in other hive worlds it may be something more, such as a simple chapel, a fortress, an outpost. It may not be permanently occupied, but it will almost always be located in one of the highest levels of the Hive City spire, because it is very rare for ordinary citizens to see these glorious Astartes come and go. Now, I think that by now we have easily illustrated that, for many common human inhabitants of a hive, their existence is bleak in extreme conditions. The work is hard, and only those who can work get accommodation and credits, and this is usually very overcrowded and very unhealthy accommodation. Despite this, many mid-level workers are considered fortunate by those who are forced to exist in the lower levels of the factorum, as these have never felt anything like a ray of sunshine and consider the streets and open spaces of the middle and upper levels as glorious places, which is reasonable, since, at least in comparison with the infinitely more polluted and violently gloomy options of the lower levels of the hive, they would choose those upper areas whenever they could. The best summary for workers and citizens is that their lives are quite simple. They enjoy the small pleasures where they can, they try to start a family where they can, and they dedicate most of their time to work. They pray and have faith in the emperor, probably attending regular religious services at the behest of the ecclesia, which always patrols the hive. They try to stay out of trouble. They'll try to make the odd deal on the black market. They will have some children, and then, as I say, probably a premature death by the standards of anyone above the working class. Life in a hive is surprisingly comparable to the industrial age of ancient Earth. Polluted, simple, often violent, with workers exploited almost from the moment they are born until the day they die, exhausted and burned out in some appalling industrial accident. The mini-storm will maintain at least a very basic presence in almost all imperial worlds in the current period. They will make sure to maintain the strong indoctrination of imperial citizens in the worship of the Holy Emperor. Of equal importance, they will be very attentive to anyone who behaves suspiciously or who, according to reports, speaks against the imperial creed, which is a very reckless measure for any imperial citizen who is probably unaware of the consequences that may befall him, which leads us to say that it is probably very medieval. The Sororitas, like the Astartes, are not very common in the worlds of the Imperium, but if they find a reason through some miraculous event that they personally witness or something or someone they believe should be protected by the Emperor and his divine power to guide them to a hive world, a hive city, they may choose to found a small convent within the hive city. This would normally be a great privilege for the hive, certainly for the ecclesiastical hierarchy, and few would refuse such an honor. The presence of a shrine or convent of sororitas within a hive would likely lead the citizens, if they had not already done so, to redouble their faith in the emperor, and it is possible that it is there that the hive world begins a path towards its designation as a shrine world, as we have discussed in a hive city and its feudal power structures, often based on noble houses of hereditary succession. The middle and lower sections of the hive cities are governed by guilds, which are actually reduced versions of the larger spires with the capacity to control the hive itself, and sometimes the planet or even a wider star system. However, guilds usually focus on mercantile operations or services for the population. So, for example, the Water Guild will deal with, as you may have guessed, the processing and recycling of water extracted from contaminated sources, as well as its supply to industrial processes when necessary. There are others, such as the Promethium Guild, which deals, as its name suggests, with promethium, which is basically a liquid fuel in the 41st millennium that can be used in industry, but is also used for weapons such as flamethrowers and many others, of course, such as the Cadaver Guild, the Air Guild, the Iron Guild, and so on. Some hives will have specific guilds, others will not, depending on their individual purposes, but in essence, if there is something in which a hive is actively involved in importing or exporting, there will probably be a guild for it. Unifying all this in a hive, there will be a more collective merchant guild, as I have already explained when talking about currency. Merchants are some of the most important, as they are often involved in drawing up agreements, contracts, exchanges, etc., between the necessary resources of the other guilds. So they fulfill a function that is difficult for others to take the time to establish on their own, which places them as a kind of middle ground that must often be quite neutral and best serve the needs of all, which includes, of course, their own needs. Now, I thought it would be convenient to take a moment to mention a specific guild, since most are relatively easy to understand: water, air, electricity, etc. However, the Coin Guild is not as obvious as its name suggests. One might think that it is exclusively related to currency, but, as we have explained, many hives operate with a very strange and unofficial economic system that is a mixture of barter, work credits, and tokens, so the term Coin Guild suggests a more formalized, minted monetary system, and this is not what it actually represents, or at least not as we know it within the hive. Most citizens are very restricted to the areas they can visit. You cannot simply travel to a level that is outside your authorized zone. So, Within the merchant guild, just like the pirate merchants, they're given freedom to traverse a hive city as long as it is limited to the operation of their business. So it follows that the coin guild are the guardians. Since they're the ones who control the roads and transport tubes that run through the structure of the hive, as well as between districts and sectors, they supervise the transport of all cargo, and sometimes within the hive worlds, they can act as tourist guides. The coin guild are the guardians, since they're the ones who control the roads and transport tubes that run through the structure of the hive, as well as between the districts and sectors. They supervise the transport of all cargo, and sometimes, within the hive worlds, they can even be designated to control the entry and exit of goods. Therefore, although they are called coin guild, for me, they represent more something like a guild of customs, borders, and merchandise operations. They control the movement and materials both internally and externally, record the information, point out unusual requests, not to mention the seizure of illegal goods and narcotics if they find them, certainly accepting the odd bribe here and there. So this title of coin guild probably comes from what is known as masters of coin, who forge keys for the guild and the convoys of the clan houses. However, these coins are more of a form of token, a powerful seal that allows the guilds and houses of a hive city to pass through the numerous stations, ash gates, and hive fortresses through which they need free passage. The coin, token, or key is a powerful symbol of the coin guild. Each of these coin masters carries with him a staff with many rings and shackles hanging with all kinds of mysterious keys, some clearly ancient and others newly forged, each of them cast with the steel of different hives or stones from different paths, which grant rights and passage to the guilder who carries it. In monetary terms, the coin guild works similarly to any other. It taxes its passageways and demands tolls from those who cross them. So, in that sense, they're not very different from other guilds. Depending on the hive, this may be in the form of barter, dashes, credits, or even thrones. It may seem that living in a hive is a lifestyle where anything goes and that people are killed on a whim, but on second thought, is it really that bad to live in the subhive? And the answer is yes. Although living in the main spire is not exactly an ideal life, it is generally preferable to the subhive, where clean air is virtually non-existent and criminal activities are everywhere. Random murders, shootings, crazed mutants on the loose, brutality, just to set an example to others, and of course, much worse things. The subhive is a truly lawless environment for the most part, and only the most hardened and well-equipped law enforcement officers venture into these depths. Enforcers, arbiters, bounty hunters, spies, and on occasion, even Rort Mechanicus inquisitors and Astartes, but this is very uncommon and not without reason. The subhive is, in short, a war zone, and choosing to live there is only for those who have little to live for. In the upper levels, crime is not tolerated at all. Arbiters and enforcers patrol the streets along with the ecclesiarchy and their ever-zealous followers. The crimes of the inhabitants of the upper levels can be much more difficult to detect because they look for things like traitors, heretics, those who seek to preach sedition. All these things fester and corrupt the minds of the citizens, and it is the role of law enforcement to seek them out and purge them from society. For any crime committed, it is important that every crime committed by the culprit is recorded with distinction so that the appropriate punishment can be assigned. If it is a matter of speaking out against the imperial creed, then the ministerium will administer justice. If it goes against the principles of the Adeptus Terra, the Arbites will intervene. Mutants, heretics, and cultists could fall on either side, as we learned earlier. Within a hive, the only option for citizens is to consume highly recycled air, water, and food of generally very questionable origin. It would be quite stupid not to point out that this will inevitably have a debilitating effect on the citizenry over time, so the mortality rate based on this and the heavy workload imposed on workers leads to very poor health. Beyond that, it will also cause the citizens' bodies to become saturated with heavy toxins, and in some cases, this will begin to cause genetic instability, birth defects, and mutations. The effects of these are demonstrably worse the further down one goes in a hive. These toxins are becoming increasingly concentrated. Depending on the hive city you are in, this may be more or less tolerated. In some worlds, mutation is more common, so minor deformities are tolerated to some extent, even in the upper hive. In others, even any minor defect may be considered a sign of chaotic contamination, or potentially, entire families could be sentenced to death as a result. So, it is very understandable that one wants to hide mutations and, when necessary, exile them to lower levels, or what is worse, unfortunately. It is very common for mutants who attract attention to be persecuted and destroyed according to the strict laws of the noble houses of the Hive administration. Those who manage to flee or newborns who are granted passage can escape and perhaps start a new life in the depths of the subhive. But they are less likely to be noticed since everyone is trying to avoid something. Only those with serious mutations are likely to find difficulties and may have to flee back to the lower levels of the subhive. Generally speaking, however, mutants can live relatively peacefully within a subhive, as always, although it is a moving scale. Mutants, like any citizen, can meet the wrong person at the wrong time, and things in the subhive tend to escalate quickly to lethal violence. Subhive gangs are, of course, synonymous with hive cities. The lowest regions of a hive city have scarce resources, and some gangs fight for territory just to boost illegal narcotics trafficking or for rights to exploit resources, while others do so simply to survive. Most will also fight for things like respect and fear-induced prestige, not to mention their personal wealth. Although the subhive economy is not necessarily directly linked to the upper levels of the hive, the gangs, of course, will have access to the same credit system and potentially even thrones, so they can indirectly transact on the black market or access the guilds of the upper levels to trade weapons, etc. In reality, the link between the lower levels of the hive city and the subhive is probably closer than the authorities want to admit. Legitimate guilds would be more than willing to sell goods or move stolen goods up. Guilds have significant power and often have the weapons and muscle to back it up, so they represent as worrying a force as gangs. The underground communities are nothing like the surface world, although only a thin veil of order holds things together, and, despite the difficulties, there is an endless flow to the underground, and those who venture down have their own reasons for doing so. But whatever the reason, it is likely to take a long time to meet their first gang, and for many, this will be a decisive experience. It is rare for a gang to recruit novices in the underworld, but in the unlikely event that they are able to defend themselves or even kill a junior member of a gang, there's a good chance that they will be recruited and obtain all the benefits that a gang offers, such as protection, more reliable access to food and shelter, and, of course, a more pleasant life than rummaging through the garbage. Obviously, the negative aspects of gangs are having to deal with your rivals, not to mention bounty hunters and law enforcement, and being sent on raids with insane goals and little chance of success, devised by drugged and crazed gang leaders. Of course, there may be any number of variations that may exist as something resembling a gang in the underworld. Renegade, tribal ramifications of lost human souls from the era of conflicts, strange bands of Xenos and chaos cultists, or just use your imagination. Perhaps you have a gang of traitorous sororitas who have fallen into the first phase of their trials and have escaped to a life of blasphemy in a sub-colony city. What about escaped prisoners from a penal hive city or deserters from the Imperial Guard who now work as mercenaries just to survive? It is one of the most interesting aspects of hive cities and the sub-colony. The characters and backgrounds of those you will find are almost limitless, and we will explore them in more detail in future reviews focused on specific groups, factions, characters, and perhaps speculative creations of our own. Finally, on planets where the environment can be very hostile, but not enough to kill you in an hour or less, there are citizens of the hives who, for one reason or another, decide to leave the vast cities. They may form a small group. Perhaps they were once a small guild and decided they are better off leaving the hive behind. Perhaps they hope that there is some small area of the planet that is not ruined by the seemingly endless ashes and contaminated wastelands. For others, they may become strange nomads who survive on the curious life forms that have found a way to survive in the wandering deserts. It is said that some of these nomadic tribes even come to appreciate the ash wastelands, which they see as something beautiful, as they sometimes show bright colors, undoubtedly coming from the various and strange metallopollutants. Mutants, but it is very difficult to say why human citizens might choose to leave the hive. The inhabitants of the lower levels could, for example, decide that things have simply become too dangerous. There are those, perhaps in the upper levels of manufacturing, who have become very disillusioned with the prospect of endless menial work, however glorious the apparent cause. In general, those seeking a life outside the hive will be looking for something, but who can really say what it is? Perhaps they have simply come to the conclusion that a life of extreme poverty and overcrowding in a decaying ruin of what might have been an arcology, subjected to strict and endless religious and judicial imposition, is not for them, and that the outside world, however distressing and extreme, is infinitely preferable to them. Who knows? On many planets where hive cities are found, the planet itself may be much larger than Terra or old Earth, so, by some miracle, these nomadic humans could one day walk far enough to find themselves in an idyllic corner, where they can find a small settlement and lead a life of subsistence, disconnected from the oppressive and often extremely dangerous life under the empire of man in the dark future of the Imperium. Hive cities are complex, numerous, and almost infinitely variable in their internal structure, population, and individual histories, and while they remain impressive in many respects, they are all too often rotten inside, decaying ruins built on and through the dilapidated structures of what were once glorious colonies. From domes to vast citadels, now do not exist as icons of humanity's technological apogee, but as a much more depressing symbol of the need to mass produce humanity's raw materials, the flesh and blood sacrifices demanded by its leaders, only to be thrown endlessly into the meat grinder of the Imperium's endless galactic wars, perpetually fueled by internal and external conflicts, often provoked by the members of the Empire themselves, not forgetting, of course, the numerous Xenos who never cease in their violent tests of the weak points along the borders of the Empire. Hive cities serve humanity in all its conflicts, fueling its insatiable desire for war materials, hardware, ammunition, but above all its endless production of millions and millions of human souls, which remain the only real currency of the empire of humanity.